are now entering the horror sanctum.
Hello and welcome to the Horror Sanctum, your home for all things horror. I'm Jay, joined by co-hosts John, Kellen, and TJ. Thank you guys for coming in for another episode. This week's movie was chosen by TJ, so with that being said, we're going to let him take over.
Okay, so this week's choice, apparently I was the only one who had seen this ever before. This is Hammer Studios' 1958 classic, The Horror of Dracula, not The Horror of Dracula.
Pronunciation is key.
Yes, you'll get a very different movie. But, so 1958, this was the first Dracula film. Hammer Studios had been around since the early 30s as kind of a lower to middle tier. They were just making whatever made money. They weren't out to try and win Oscars or anything. They were making war movies, melodramas, silly comedies. But in 1957, they struck a deal with Universal to kind of repurpose all of the old Universal monster horror properties. And they started with the Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee actually played Frankenstein, and Peter Cushing took on what is his most famous role other than Dr. Van Helsing, which was Dr. Frankenstein. The Frankenstein and the Dracula series were the longest, kind of in tandem, were the longest running series for Hammer. And the big thing that sold these movies was they were the first time that these classic monsters ever appeared in color. And specifically for the Dracula films, it was the first time that they were ever exploiting blood in color, or blood at all, really. And also kind of the sexy element, which started kind of just with more bust and stuff, kind of the 50s, early 60s. But by the time 1970s rolled around, they exploited that a lot more as the hippie culture kind of come out. This is my personal favorite Hammer film. It's not my favorite Dracula film, but it's my personal favorite Hammer film. Mostly because if you come up with the AMC movie channel in our generation and we're watching it at all, and to an extent Turner Classic Movies, but AMC really for about 10 years just played the heck out of this film and most of like the Mummy films, the Frankenstein films, but the horror films got a lot of play. And that was at a time where AMC wasn't making original programming and they didn't have a whole lot of licenses, so they just basically showed the vast majority of these Hammer films on repeat. So I've probably seen this film dozens of times over the years.
That's hilarious since we all watched it for the first time today.
Yeah, I know. So I was like, wow, I guess different experience. But
this week.
This was Christopher Lee's first speaking role, I believe, in a Hammer film because he played the Frankenstein monster the year before this. And this is still like just the second biggest Hammer film, horror film. So they become the studio that was known. It was even called the studio that dripped blood at certain times because it became the house that horror built. And they did a play on that when they created a TV series in 1980 near the end of their prominence called Hammer's House of Horror, which is on Shudder streaming and Amazon, I think. But essentially they owned and cornered the market on horror from 1957 until the early 70s when exploitation films really started to pick up. And then once Texas Chainsaw Massacre and that kind of stuff took off, then the market got diluted. But throughout at least the mid-70s, from the late 50s, it was all about Hammer. They mostly did gothic
Would you
films.
say it was Hammer, Tom?
It was Hammer time.
Bum, 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 bum.
Very much so. Mostly they did gothic horror films, and that was mainly because they were still a cheap studio, even though they started making money, especially in the American markets. They actually made more money with their British films in the U.S. selling them to us than they did overseas. And they just kept repurposing the same sets. Once you start watching and rewatching a lot of these films, you can tell, even in the same movies, they'll just redress the same sets. There's actually a scene when I think it's Jonathan Harker is coming into the castle for the first time. You see the big staircase as he first comes in. Then he enters a room, which is actually just the same room, dressed differently, with the exact same staircase. There's a lot of that stuff when you look for it, because they had a handful of sets they just used for everything.
Yeah.
Around 1970-ish, they started trying to make modern films. They're mostly known as the Gothic Horror Studio. Those are very hit or miss. There's a couple Dracula films that are like Dracula 1972 AD. They get very hippie-ish in the 70s.
Very
but
hip.
yeah, but typically they're known as the Gothic horror. When people think about Gothic horror, when you talk about Fright Night, a classic from 1985, one of my favorite horror films, that is a total parody of the character Peter Vincent is named for Vincent Price and Peter Cushing, and he is basically playing a parodied character of Dr. Van Helsing, Peter Cushing's character that he played in, I think, 3 Hammer horror films. So that's my intro. Not my first time seeing this. Jay, what did you think about it?
So here's my thing, and I told you guys earlier, but if you're listening at home in your car, I am in the room with a dog with a nasal tumor and snores. So the grunts are not Dracula sneaking up behind you; they are merely the grunts and snores of a puppy. So first time seeing it. For those of you listening, I also assume you haven't seen it. Maybe a few of you have, maybe you haven't. So the basic plot is Van Helsing's friend, Mr. Harker, goes to Dracula's castle with the intent to kill him. It doesn't work out for him. Van Helsing comes looking for him. Of course, there's a little bit more to it than that, but we all watched it on HBO Max. I think you can maybe see it on YouTube and some other places. I enjoyed it. There were 2 incredibly iconic scenes in the film. When we first meet Dracula and he's just standing at the top of those stairs, menacing, is like his silhouette. Like, that's frightening because he's giant. He's got that cape on.
Yeah, Christopher Lee's like 6'5".
Oh, is he that tall?
Yeah, he's a tall boy.
I didn't know that.
He looked tall in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. And then, he comes downstairs to greet Mr. Harker. The second scene that I really enjoyed, it sounds like a book club, so the second scene that was pivotal, it was even on Shudder's 101 Scariest Movie Moments of All Time. The first episode was the horror of Dracula. See, I said both syllables. Yeah, thanks. I've been practicing at home.
Thanks for the alliteration.
I laugh every time I hear the intro, and it runs.
But when the lady vampire comes up on Mr. Harker, she's trying to, she's like, help me. And that's when we first see Dracula. Then fast forward, and she's trying to seduce him and get him to help her again. We don't necessarily know she's a vampire at first, but obviously she turns out to be one. She goes for the neck, nips it. But that whole scene when we see Christopher Lee's face, it just like zooms into his face really fast. You hear that like iconic, like he hisses, blood dripping out of his mouth. Like, that's terrifying. Like, that is a very terrifying moment. Then he goes and makes the lady stop. But I think Shudder is pretty, their staff knows what they're talking about. They know what they're doing. So to include a scene like that in the 101 Scariest Moments, although I don't know if you guys have watched, I definitely don't agree to all of them, but I'm also
I don't agree to half of them.
I'm very desensitized. So, but here's what I know. You said this was his first speaking role, Christopher Lee as Dracula.
I don't think it's his first total speaking role, but working with Hammer films, it was his first major speaking role for sure.
And do you know how many lines he had in that movie?
I think he only had 13, if I'm not mistaken.
I actually know the number to this.
I used to know the number. It's like 12 or 13, isn't it?
John,
16, I believe, right?
16.
Wow.
The man has 16 lines. I think he's in the film for what, 7 minutes?
It's just a few minutes, yeah.
This movie is named after the man. He's in it 7 minutes. He has 16 lines, but he crushes it every time you see him on screen. Like, he's very charismatic. And it made me go down the rabbit hole. I'm like, is he my favorite actor to play Dracula? And there was Bella, Gary Oldman, and then, Gerard Butler. Dracula 2000.
Which Bella technically only played Dracula one time. He played 2 other films that were basically playing Dracula, but for copyright reasons couldn't be Dracula.
But that's the one we automatically go to, the one we think we're Dracula,
Yeah.
I don't know. I was thinking about them. I have no idea which one. Like between him and Christopher Lee, it's super hard. Of course, Gary Oldman was great too, but we only got one serving of that.
Maybe Eddie Murphy, Vampires in Brooklyn.
Oh, Lord.
That's true. Leslie Nielsen. I mean, there's so many. I don't know. I think Lee does it for me after watching that today, because I've seen Christopher Lee in tons of movies. I honestly don't think I've ever sat down and watched a Christopher Lee vampire movie. I don't think I ever have.
That's what put him on the map. That's why everybody wants to put him in capes in all these movies.
Yeah, but he was great, and I think gun to head, I think he's probably my favorite Dracula. Peter Cushing's also my favorite Van Helsing. Sorry, Hugh Jackman.
Oh, by a mile. By a mile.
But yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, he was fantastic.
Yeah, I enjoyed the film a lot. I watched it twice because I record Svengoolie, which, if you don't know, is on MeTV. Yeah. And he hosts a 2 hour and a half movie because he only has a 2-hour slot. He just happened to be doing horror of Dracula.
What are the chances?
I know, it's been like a month. It was like a month ago, but I just watched it with him again because it's fun watching once, it's fun watching twice, but when you have somebody in between making silly jokes, it's a little bit better.
That's a pretty good license for him to get. Like, this movie in particular is kind of the most coveted of all the Christopher Lee Draculas because, it's the first. And it's the only one that kind of even closely somewhat follows the plot of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is not even following that so much as it is trying to follow the main beats of the Bela Lugosi Dracula film with a few changes.
Yeah. And being a Warner Brothers film, I mean, that's a big get for Svengoolie, honestly.
Yeah.
I had one more thing I liked about it, more about the movie making, is you notice every time we see Christopher Lee, it's from below. Like, the camera angle's down here, it's not even, it's not up, which just made him that much, more menacing.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Like, I like when I pick up on stuff like that. But that just made it that much more enjoyable. I mean, Christopher Lee's pretty perfect anyways.
Yeah.
And whatever he does, so.
He was also the first Dracula to wear the really red contact lenses, and the first Dracula to show fangs. Bela Lugosi never wore fangs.
Those were awful fangs. He also hated those contacts. Like, he was having issues with them on set.
Yeah.
And, like, he couldn't see half the time.
Yeah. Well, it's just like Bruce Campbell in Evil Dead. Like, contact lenses in the 70s and early 80s were not what they are today.
Sorry, dog. As you can see. Keep talking. I'm just setting back up.
Okay.
But
Kellen, what do you think about it?
So going into it, I kind of had an idea I was going to like it. I did read a little bit about it, that it was in the UK, it was just known as Dracula. They changed the name of the movie because they were afraid it would confuse people with the Bela Lugosi Dracula Universal Monsters.
Yeah.
But so the things that I picked up on are probably going to be different than everybody else because that style of movie I love. And that's the 40s and 50s. They follow kind of the same pattern. As far as the way it's filming, there's always that one somewhat goofy character. It's like the person they're trying to get the information on where the coffin was going, and they show him making the goofy faces. That was characteristic of all of those movies back then. But you talked about
comic relief.
Yeah. Even if it didn't really necessarily fit, it was the style of the movies from the 40s and 50s where there was always there was always certain characters in every film. Didn't matter if it was a comedy, action kind of movie, a drama. There was always that
Yeah.
They followed that same, formula.
Yeah.
But
literally every Universal horror film has that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really starting with Bride of Dracula. That's probably the first time I remember really seeing that comedy element too.
Well, even if you go to non-horror films like Breakfast at Tiffany's, you had Mickey Rooney playing the goofy character, which is terrible now, but at the time,
I remember the film.
He doesn't fit in.
think.
Yeah, he doesn't fit in that movie at all, but he's there because that was that style. Movies that were more driven by the actors' physical emotions as opposed to the dialogue. The score for the movie drove the emotion that you felt. You knew what the scene was going to be about based on the the crescendo of the orchestra and the direction that the music changed. I really enjoyed the quick cut. There's a scene in there where it cuts from one scene straight to Dracula. There's no fade, just straight to him. The music changes. It's an intense scene for, it's not like you could call it a jump scare for the time to just go from, a dialogue heavy scene to straight to Dracula's face. But you mentioned something about sets, and it made me think of one of my favorite movies, Holiday Inn, not a horror film, but you talked about they repurposed the sets. Repaint the walls and things like that. There's a scene in Holiday Inn where the girl from the movie goes to Hollywood to film Holiday Inn. The idea behind this,
I don't know Holiday.
It's Bing Crosby and Fred Astaire.
Oh,
I've seen that.
Bing Crosby builds an inn where he decides to leave.
It's a sequel to Black Christmas. The sequel to Black Christmas. You see?
No, it's Bing Crosby leaves the singing, dancing life to go live on a farm, and then decides to turn that farm into an inn to make money. Anyway, these producers from Hollywood decide that they want to make it into a movie, the idea, and so there's a scene in the movie where they show the house as a movie set. So it's the exact same house. Everything's the same, but they actually show it as the set. And I always thought that was just a neat little thing to see in a movie, that they actually took the set and showed it as a set.
That is cool. And cheaper.
But talking about Christopher Lee, such an amazing actor to have, 50, 60, 70-year career as an actor. He was well into his 90s, maybe 99, I think, when he passed. He was an older gentleman.
Yeah.
But it reminded me of Michael Keaton as Beetlejuice. Michael Keaton's not in that. He has a lot more dialogue than Christopher Lee has, but he's not in that movie for maybe 16 minutes.
Yeah.
But he's what everybody remembers from that movie. And it's the same with this, with Horror of Dracula. You remember Christopher Lee, even though he is not in the movie for a significant amount of time. And like you said, 16 lines. I mean, he's not even talking that much, but he's such an indomitable figure that you're drawn to him. And like I said, I didn't take notes, but I did read about it. And Christopher Lee's portrayal of Dracula in this movie, it was kind of the first time he had been quote unquote sexualized. Like, he was a very handsome man, and that shows on the screen. It's the first time that Dracula is portrayed as somebody that women might lust after, which I thought was kind of a neat thing. The last thing I want to point out, and again, it's little things that I noticed that maybe other people don't. I love movies like this because they use what they have. There's no special effects. Everything's practical. And so, film editing tricks that they used, like in most of those movies from the 40s and 60s, where they'll cut and splice the film to create those illusions of things appearing and disappearing. When I can't remember any of the names, but when the woman, her husband goes to give her the cross, and she takes it and it burns her hand and passes out. When Van Helsing goes to pry the cross out of her hand, if you watch, he's holding it on top of the markings in her hand so that it doesn't shift. So instead of it moving around, it would burn another spot. If you watch, he is holding it to her hand in the spot that it's supposed to be in until her hand is fully open, and then he lifts it up. And I thought that was just a neat little sidebar as far as, they're using the practical effects. How are they going to make this effect look real? we'll just have him hold the cross in place until it's time to remove the cross.
Yeah.
But overall, I mean, I knew, like I said, I enjoy these 40s and 50s style of films. I grew up watching a lot of those, a lot of the older stuff with my grandfather. So I knew I was going to enjoy it. I just didn't know that what a classic movie it was until TJ decided to make the rest of us watch it with him.
And what about that score? You alluded to the score.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's like I said, that was those movies back then were driven by the score. Like I think a lot of times they had the orchestra either watching the movie or playing during some of the scenes to build the suspense or to build the emotions in the movie. So it was like the orchestra was actually playing to the film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of these Hammer films have just superb, like way above what their budgets would make you believe, orchestrations to them.
Yeah, and it covers most of the film. There's very few parts in that movie where it's just dialogue. I mean, there's a soft playing in the background of most scenes in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, Christopher Lee didn't even talk to anybody besides Harper. Like,
No.
he hisses and stuff, but he never speaks to anybody in that movie besides Harper.
That's
Just
true.
grunts. That's it.
True.
Yeah, grunts and hisses, that's it.
Because that's all you have to do to communicate to your many brides. Right?
That's how you know it's all, the whole movie was all in Harper's mind, and that's a spoiler to the end of the movie. But yeah, it was all in his head the whole time. It's crazy.
Wait, what? Did we watch the same movie? Was there a post-credit scene? Was this where Marvel got the idea?
take on
Because
it.
That's the Inception edit.
Inception edit.
Director's cut.
Right.
What do you think, John?
I liked it. It was probably the first time I had seen it that I know of. I took some different notes. The first note I'm just going to have to read. I thought this was funny at the time. Now I realize it was horrible to write it. I'm just going to read it verbatim.
Such is life.
Two Anthonys working on the behind the scenes, according to the opening credits. So somebody has to go by Tony alone. Am I right? Hold for laughter and applause.
I'll give you
So
that.
now you see how my brain works.
Golf clap.
It looked like it's maybe Technicolor. I'm not sure if it was Technicolor.
I think it was. I think that's actually how they promoted these first few Hammer films, because it was the first time blood was ever in color and bright red color, which is why blood is trickling on the name Dracula for no apparent reason. That's the credit
Just because they
sequence.
could.
Just because they could.
It was like
what you're in for.
Yeah, it was like a that paintish look.
Yeah.
The opening, it's interesting. The opening is not scary because it's a different way of approaching the story. It doesn't have the same gothic feel as like the 1931 Dracula or Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, Bram Stoker's Dracula for me is a terrifying film just because of nostalgia and the gothic elements and the look. But it's a great film. It's funny that Christopher Lee, he didn't have a lot of lines in this movie like we were talking about. He doesn't do a lot, but the irony is this is his best, from what I can tell, this is his best portrayal of Dracula. And the later movies where he is Dracula, his role's expanded, but those are not as good of films. So the irony is his best film, he has the least screen time, and his more screen time is, I just thought that was kind of funny.
Actually, in the second film, which he never wanted to do a sequel, the studios actually booked and had like release dates, already had the crew hired, and then just had him over a barrel saying, well, if you don't want to play him, we got to fire all these people that are your friends that helped make you
That's
a
good
name.
director, bad director.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's why there wasn't a sequel from 1958 until 1965, and Dracula, Prince of Darkness was the second one that he reprised. They made another vampire movie, I believe, in 1960, where Peter Cushing comes back as Van Helsing, but they couldn't secure Lee to come back then, so they just had some other vampire, and they called it The Brides of Dracula, even though Dracula's not in it.
Yeah.
But he hated
Bamboozled.
He hated the script so much for Prince of Darkness, he refused to say any of the lines, and then he just grunts and screams the whole time.
Yeah, and earlier I made a flubber. I realized I was talking about the first humor in horror. It was Bride of Frankenstein. Bride of Dracula. That is, in fact, the sequel. Is it Brides of Dracula that you just said?
The Brides
Yeah.
of Dracula is the alternate American name for the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which is the 1973 last Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Hammer Dracula film.
Yeah, there's so many of these, and they're easy to kind of mix up. One of the scenes that I really liked in the movie, though, that I thought was kind of funny was the retelling of the rules, the way they portrayed it, where Van Helsing is dictating to himself about garlic and the steak. And it's obvious that he knows the answers. He's talking to himself, and it's like he's quizzing himself on his own information. But it's kind of the director's way of sort of restating the rules, because at that time period, we know the rules now. I think my wife would know the rules. She's not even a horror fan, but I think back then the audience probably wasn't as familiar, so the rules would be like a new thing.
Which, by the way, they totally throw out in some of the sequels. Like, I think in this movie they say he can't turn into wolves and bats, but by the 70s he's totally turning into bats.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the best. I think the best portrayal in the film, though, isn't Christopher Lee. I think it's Michael Gouge. He was Arthur in the movie.
Did anybody recognize him from later films?
He's most famously from Batman 1989 and Batman Returns. He was Alfred.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought he was fantastic in this movie. I just thought he was, the way he started, and he was in disbelief. He didn't trust Van Helsing. He was a very straight man. And then all it took was that one thing to happen in the movie. And it was like he immediately was like, I'm with you. I'm there. He's like the buddy cop. Like, they're like side by side. So I really like that part of it. The film itself, I would say it's a great film. I would say my rating, I don't know. It's hard to say. It's definitely in the 7s for me. It's not my favorite Dracula film by any means, but I think it is a great film. I think it's a great introduction to Hammer. It's one scene in particular that I was thinking of that was kind of funny, that later on is played on so much in other films, is the scene with the staking where Van Helsing is actually it's the first scene where Jonathan is trying to stake the female vampire in the lair. Yeah. And I thought to myself, that's so funny how every vampire film has kind of used that, where the person staking the vampire takes a really long time, right? So they set up, they get their stake out, they just slowly hit, and the vampire slowly wakes up and screams, and the other vampire takes like way too long to wake up.
Yeah.
And it's almost like this running gag in vampire films. And the only vampire film that doesn't do that is Fright Night. Because when they do that in Fright Night, if you remember, they try to do that to Jerry Dandridge, and he like sits up mid-stake and grabs it. And I was like, finally, someone breaks this cliche in the vampire films. But I just thought that was interesting that's probably the first time in a Dracula or a vampire film I had seen that, where it was that situation,
Yeah. So. Well, and because of the Hays Code in the 30s and early 40s, the early Universal films couldn't show staking. So even when Dracula's staked, you hear it, but it's happening off screen. And so this was.
If we're going to talk about stakings. If we're going to talk about stakings, we can't neglect to mention the greatest vampire staking of all time. No, Paul Rubens at the end of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh yes.
Yeah. That is good.
When he's and then they go away from him, and then they come back in the credits, and he's still on the ground dying.
An underappreciated film.
That's awesome.
That is good. Man. I just love the massive, copious amounts. I can't see the graveyard staking scene in this film now without thinking of all the just copious amounts of blood pouring over Steven Weber's face in the Mel Brooks Dracula Dead and Loving It parody now.
Oh, right.
And he's like, sometimes you just got to know where to stand.
Yeah, I think this movie though really works on a lot of levels. I think the only negative though, for me is that it's probably a little too short. I think that's probably why I would not rate it higher. I think honestly, and this is a first time watch. I'm sure as I watch it more, I'll get a different feel on it. But I think you probably could have added 10 to 15 more minutes on it. I mean, by the time it was over, I was like, what?
Yeah.
That's it? Like I
I
was
think it's only
wanting
82
more.
minutes.
So yeah.
Hour and
So,
21. Yeah,
yeah.
and some change.
Perfect.
Which I like a good 90-minute movie.
I'm a good proponent of 125, 130. Like, was it Terrifier 2 is what, 2 hours long? That's
2 hours, 18 minutes.
disrespectful.
Oh my gosh.
That's crazy.
Like,
That's
it's
crazy.
insane. And I'm like, oh, somebody posts like going to the theater to see Terrifier 2. I'm like, why? It will be on a streaming service next week, and you don't have to sit in the theater for 2 hours. But yeah, I'm with John. I enjoyed it. I base movies differently. Like, you know things about me. You know I'm a little off book when it comes to things that I enjoy and like. But to me, when I think about a movie and I give the Spaceman ratings on Instagram and Facebook, I consider would I watch it again. So would I watch it again? Would I tell someone else they should watch it? You know, things like that. Like that stuff happens to me. I watched the movie twice today. I would make Lindsay watch it when she gives me that rare opportunity to make her watch a scary movie. We watched Cabin in the Woods last night, and she was terrified. This is a horror comedy. You're fine, but you know, I don't just do the direction, the acting. Like obviously, one of my biggest hang-up in movies is character development, and when we have characters that we don't like, and I told you guys that the new Jeepers Creepers, it sucks. It's terrible. And it starts out great, but then they introduce you to the main characters. And as soon as you meet them, you hate them. You absolutely hate them. That's another episode for another day where we can watch that garbage. But
I'm so sad about that. I look so forward to rebooting the franchise.
I was very disappointed. I didn't know dude was a pedo, the director from the original movies.
Yeah, I didn't realize to the extent of what that was, but
I kept posting about Jeepers Creepers, and they were just like, just glad that pedo's gone. I'm like, what is going on? Finally, someone told me. I mean, I had no idea. I watched the first Jeepers Creepers the other day, and I feel dirty. But I enjoyed it. I would recommend it to people, especially like my mom and Lindsay. They don't like horror movies. It's hard to talk them into watching one. This is a great starting point for them. Besides Chris, I'm sure the ladies think Christopher Lee is nice to look at too as Dracula. But I would give it. I think I settled on 4 out of 5 today. Bats.
Okay. Yeah, we're on a 4 out of 5.
4 out of 5, and we're just whatever. But yeah, I say 4 out of 5. Like again, twice today. I would watch it again this weekend if I didn't have anything else to do. So I enjoyed it. Good job.
Well, the rewatchability of an 82-minute movie is so much more than even a 100-minute movie, just mentally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about you, Kellen? What's your rating and final thoughts?
I'm with Jay. I think for what the movie is, it's not really necessarily worried about the backstory. They do, like he said, kind of like the educational moment where he's Van Helsing is telling everybody what vampires can and can't do. I think Jay had mentioned this. I don't know if it's before we started recording or not, but Peter Cushing as Van Helsing was fantastic.
Iconic.
I just love the gentlemanliness, the look. You go to Hugh Jackman wearing bondage leather almost kind of outfits, but that just button down suit, vest, just a gentleman who also happens to kill vampires.
But what about Kate Beckinsale's suit?
That's a different
that was a much
thing.
better. Leather works better for certain folks than others.
Correct.
Right.
But it's just, I think the length of the movie for what they were doing was perfect. There wasn't a lot of drawn out scenes. The movie flowed really well. I mean, it starts off fairly quick. I mean, there's maybe 5 minutes for you to get settled in before, the first big occurrence happens. And then from there, it progresses in a natural flow. I like to consider these movies kind of like plays. You could actually make this movie as a stage show, because the way it's shot, the way the sets are, it could be a play. And that's kind of how they film these things, in long takes, long scenes. The actors would just go through. There's not a whole lot of cuts from camera to camera. So it's the perfect length for something that's kind of basically a recorded play.
Yeah. And most all of them are classically trained and had that training to do long takes.
Yeah. And so and that's what I love about it. That's that classic acting skill that you're not relying on 15 different takes and them cutting the best pieces together. It's you're just going to have to muscle through this scene and get it right. We don't have a whole lot of film in the can, where there's not a whole lot of redos. Learn your lines, go and then do it. And then that's when you look at these actors and you think, wow, these guys were incredible for what they did, because they're going through with practical effects, so they're not going to be able to redo a whole lot of that without having to redo everybody's makeup. So they're going to have to you've got to get this scene right. I mean, true professionals, the 40s and 30s, 40s, 50s, even in the 60s. So I'm going to stick with John though on the rating thing, because I like the leeway of a 10-point scale. I feel constrained by 5.
Fine until our next episode. Don't worry.
Five is difficult because
you don't have as much.
Yeah,
I feel like there's going to be some movies where I'm going to want to give a 5 to, because it's not terrible, but on that scale you're going to have to give it a 2.5, and that sounds terrible. So this is an awful movie. No, it's a fine movie. It's just not great. It's not terrible. But I would give it a solid 7.
But 7 is 3.5 stars.
3.5 stars.
So it's the same thing.
But I could give it a 7. What's a 7.5? What if I gave it a 7.5, Jay? What is that? 3.75 stars. Is that what we're gonna have to? Is that what we're gonna have to start doing?
I would give it a
solid 7.
Absolutely do that. You know what else too? It's 100% like a play. Like I love that feel too. I was thinking as Kellen was saying everything, I'm glad I didn't watch it before, because I've always enjoyed horror movies, but the deep dive I've taken as of late has been the last 10 years. My taste has changed dramatically. I used to think that Ghost Ship was the greatest movie that ever existed. Like I don't have great taste at certain stages in my life. So had I watched this 20 years ago, I'm like, I'll never watch another Hammer movie ever, because that was just how I perceive things then. But now, you can appreciate it now. It's kind of like Seinfeld. I never watched Seinfeld as a kid, and I'm glad I didn't, because it's funnier now. I understand it now. It makes more sense. But that was something
you can relate to the characters as an adult in Seinfeld, and you can appreciate the craft of a movie like this as an adult.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm George. Like I'm 110% George on Seinfeld. Like he cracks me up. But anyways, point being, sometimes it's okay not to see this stuff when we were younger. It just helps you appreciate it.
Yeah. Agreed.
Or if you're like me, you grew up watching all the Universal horrors and all the Hammer things, and you just kind of went through the different seasons of the history of horror as you got older. That's kind of
we grew up with Full Moon on UPN on Saturday afternoon. So if it wasn't Puppet Master or something with Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton, that's the horror that we grew up to. I remember going
Tales from the Crypt.
The video store and seeing all the movies on the counter that my mom wouldn't let me get, and which is fine. Now I watch them whenever I want to. But, it was just, that's what we grew up with, instead of that's why we turned out the way we did and started a podcast called Weirdos, because we grew up with Full Moon rather than Hammer. We weren't sophisticated.
Well, I still dip my toe into Full Moon, but not until my teens.
One thing I did notice about the portrayal that was interesting was when they first showed Christopher Lee, he looked very normal. He acted normal. That first few minutes, he was scary, but he was normal, right? There was no oddness about him. In contrast, Bela Lugosi, Gary Oldman, you see them the first time, you're like, this is the devil. This is a bad guy. Immediately, they're creepy. It's a sneak. And then with Christopher Lee, it's interesting. He's normal, and then immediately, like we were talking about that infamous scene where he hisses and the fangs come out, you're like, oh crap. And I thought that was kind of an interest. I just thought it was very interesting how the director made that choice to turn the story on its head, just with Jonathan Harker and the way they did Dracula. That was definitely intentional. There was something he was trying to say there.
It's like you caught me in my true form. I was putting on the face of this aristocratic gentleman to lure you in because he needed him for his services. In this film, it's like he needed him to go through his library and document everything, where in every other version, Jonathan Harker is a like a real estate lawyer that's working out his deal for Carfax Abbey in England.
It was interesting he chose not to leave. But yeah. All right, so TJ, this is your movie.
Wait, did John give his rating?
Yeah, he said 7. He started the 10 system.
Okay.
I'll go with if we're going 5, I'll go with 3.5 out of 5.
Okay. I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5 or an 8 out of 10, whatever rating your own. I don't know. I still think Bela Lugosi will always be my first love Dracula because it's one of the first horror films I ever watched. I rented it from the neighboring town's library. They had 2 horror films. I rented them both, 1931's Dracula and 1959's The House on Haunted Hill. And I was scared by both of them because I was 8. But so that will kind of always be my first Dracula, but really close second is going to be Christopher Lee, specifically in this film. This is the film I always come back to. I come back to this one and the next one, Prince of Darkness, probably because they were the ones that played in constant rotation the most on AMC, so I've watched them the most, even though Prince of Darkness is a terrible movie. He doesn't even utter a line of dialogue, and they couldn't even get Peter Cushing back. So it's just it's like a old Scottish priest that's drunk half the time ends up being the character for this one film. But
classic.
It's 4 out of 5 for me. I had one last little thing I just looked up. The budget for this film. And granted, this was 1958, and this is in British pounds, which, is not quite a 1-to-1 conversion, but only £81,000 they made this film. And that was a pretty standard budget for these times. And what they get out of repurposing, I mean, they had a factory of filmmaking. By this time, they've been making films for 25 years. They knew how to do this efficiently on a budget, get it out, get it released, make enough money to come back and do it again. And they were pushing out like, a dozen of these things on the same sets a year. So quick turnaround. You got like 3-4 weeks to shoot, and then you're on to the next thing. Because they kept employing all the same directors and lighting people and all this stuff. And just, you can tell because of that, there's a consistency in these, especially the first probably 10 years worth of movies that they were putting out. There's a consistency. Quality starts to diminish come the latter part of the 60s and into the 70s. But for my money, this film, one of the best portrayals of Dracula, and what put Christopher Lee on the acting map until, his passing in 2015. I mean, he was still an iconic big star and just kept getting in bigger franchises.
Yeah.
Now, the trivia question for you guys.
I
could go 2 different ways with it, but I'm going to throw you just a slight curveball. Just a slight curveball.
Okay.
How many times in major motion pictures did Christopher Lee portray the character of Dracula?
Hey,
Yes.
he did that 7 times.
Oh, you're almost right. He did it 7 times for Hammer. Any other buzzes?
Kellen, I know he played Dracula 10 times. I think once or twice was uncredited, so I'm going to say 8.
Yes, you are correct.
Got it.
7 times for Hammer, and then a Jesse Franco film called Count Dracula, which is more of a it was kind of because he never for Hammer got to tell a closer to Bram Stoker's book telling of the story, where he's more of a Nosferatu kind of ugly kind of creature. Jesse Franco made a lot of exploitation films, early 70s.
Yes.
James'
of
daddy.
them.
Yeah.
So he did one version where he's ugly, closer to the book for Jesse Franco. So 8 in total.
Kelly, congratulations. So Kelly will be picking our movie for our next episode. That should be fun.
Yes, I'm
As
excited.
someone who knows the extent of his horror movies.
Well, I like we've gone over it. I like the B movies, so I'm gonna try not to go to something that's just cheesy and awful. I'll try to come up with something that I think everybody will at least enjoy.
I like
Works
some
either
cheese.
way. Yeah. All right. Well, that's going to be it for this week's episode. Thank you guys for joining us. Be sure to go follow us on Instagram. Just search the Horror Sanctum podcast. We're on there. You can find us on YouTube, the Horror Sanctum podcast as well. We'll be doing videos bi-weekly as well, so you can look at our pretty faces. And if you're on Facebook, find us at the Church Horror Sanctum Facebook group, where we're talking this stuff every day. But for me, that's it. Again, thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
And keep it spooky.
Later.